Have you ever tried to get something to work and couldn't get it to work and you didn't know why and you get frustrated and you end up throwing things because it won't work, especially electrical appliances and TVs? It was a few weeks ago. Emily and I were watching TV, watching a DVD, and looked at all the cords, couldn't get the thing to play. Scrolling through, it was as if the TV wasn't recognizing our DVD player. And I'm like, I look at the cords and all the cords are there. Cords seem to be stuck in the right place in the TV. Why isn't this working? And this goes on for 10 minutes or so. Until, and we're about ready to go to the living room and watch it on the other DVD player. And then I go back around and I'm looking at all the cords. And then I noticed that there's one cord that's just kind of lying there. And guess what cord that was? The power cord. It ain't going to work if you don't have power, right? Ever tried to get something done and you end up feeling stupid because it was the power cord? One of my favorite Christmas movies is Christmas Vacation. And in that movie, my favorite scene, it's actually a series of scenes where Sparky or Chevy Chase can't get the lights on, right? You remember this? It's all about power. And of course the resolution, spoiler alert by the way, if you haven't seen this, spoiler alert, it's all on a light switch, right? His wife figures out that there's no power going, and he has spent half the movie trying to, checks out all the light bulbs, even spends some time freezing in the attic, all because there was no power to the bulbs. Power and no power, that's at the heart of our gospel lesson, our epistle lesson this morning. No power is at the heart of Romans chapter 1. We tend to live our lives powerless. We tend to live our lives powerless, and I'm not talking about the kind of power that it takes to make us feel better, the kind of power that it takes to improve ourselves. I'm not talking about, you can hear people talk, oh, you need this kind of power in order to get where you want to go and be a certain person and all this. We're not talking about that kind of power. We're talking about no power to save ourselves. We're talking about no power to do what we're supposed to do and be the kind of person we're supposed to be. We're talking about no power to obey God's rules. No power to actually believe what we're supposed to believe. No power to do good works for others. No power for growth. No power to say a graceful word when it's needed. No power. And in Romans chapter 1, we find out why that's such a problem. No power. In Romans 1, before Paul is done, and we're going to talk about that, Paul is writing to a church just outside of Rome, or in Rome itself. But he's writing to a group of people that are struggling with no power. And the problem is that they have either plugged themselves into the wrong thing or they aren't plugged in at all. No power. And you see, the problem that we find here in Romans 1 is the problem that has been with us and with them since Adam and Eve in the garden. God created Adam and Eve in perfection. And he put them in a garden, and he says, here, you take care of this. In fact, part of their responsibility was to take that garden and expand it. Keep it, till it, expand it. To fill the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth with this garden. But the book of Genesis tells us that didn't happen. Adam and Eve disobeyed. They decided that they wanted to be like God and know, like God, the difference between good and evil. Adam and Eve wanted autonomy. They wanted independence from God. And what they ended up getting was no power. No power to love God, no power to improve themselves, no power to save themselves. No power for any of that. Not only can we not save ourselves, not only do we not have that power, we don't even have the internal fortitude inside of ourselves to make it happen. That's how destitute we are. No power. Dead. And Paul talks about that here in Romans 1, our passage. Now again, Paul's writing to a church either in Rome or just outside of Rome in the early first century. And these are people that, like us, have come to gather, and they're gathering in a home or gathering in a hall, and they're getting together, and they have come to know who Jesus is and have come to have faith in Him. So much so that Paul says, hey, your faith, people are talking about your faith all over the world. So it's not like they had that kind of faith, the kind of faith that brought them together and had brought them into a gathering just like we're doing this morning. But somewhere along the way, they, for whatever reason, had started to wander. They started to think there's got to be more to it than this. They started to think that they could please God themselves. That they could do this themselves. That they could save themselves. That they could write their own destiny. And Paul says, it's been like this since the garden. Don't make that mistake. Don't make the same mistake that Adam and Eve have done. Now, Angela did not read it, but if we were to read a little further in this chapter, he actually gets into why it's impossible for us to improve ourselves, why it's impossible for his own audience to improve themselves and make everything better. Listen to what Paul says in this chapter. This occurs following the section we read. God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. For God's invisible attributes, that is, His eternal power and His divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what He's made. And as a result, people are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Therefore, God delivered them over in the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. And they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served what has been created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. Amen. So it's very easy to read this section and think of all the bad things that are going on here, all the things that man has been corrupted with, to read all of this, what Paul's saying, and think, oh, that's pretty bad. That's not us. Who does this? Who exchanges God for a lie? Who pursues, even to the point of sexual immorality? Who pursues the worship of things outside of God? Who does that? Not us. The reality is that's all of us. He's describing every single one of us sitting here. Every single person that's ever been born. That's us. That's all of us. At any given moment. That's my thinking. I'm thinking that way. I'm doing that. We're all narcissists by nature, all of us. We're all in it for ourselves in one form or another. Now, we have good ways of hiding it. We get pretty good at masking it. In fact, sometimes we can mask it as generosity, but we're looking for some scratching on the back on our end. That section right there is describing who we are internally. And that's why we have no power to save ourselves, to improve ourselves, to make ourselves better. And the thing is, we know better. We're without excuse. We internally know this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And our dark hearts are constantly trying to one-up each other. We're constantly trying to one-up God. Even in our best moments, we tend to somehow manage to turn it inward, to make it about us. And then we begin to believe that the rules that God has laid down for us, good rules, can those rules order our lives? Yeah, they can order our lives if we live by those rules. Rules help. But the problem with the rules is the moment we start looking at those and believing those things to be the source of our change is the moment that we start to have faith that those rules can save us. That it's those rules that are actually making the life change. That the law can save us, that God's law can save us from ourselves. And again, before we start to throw stones at this audience in Romans, we do this all the time. We begin to believe that our rules and the way we've crafted our lives is somehow going to save us. And Paul is going to spend the rest of this letter, there are 16 chapters in the book of Romans, he's going to spend the rest of this book shooting all that down. He spills a lot of ink to make sure that we know that we can't do this, that we can't save ourselves. See, Paul has something else to offer us. Instead of offering us more rules and more self-salvation, Paul offers us the gospel. Paul says he's not ashamed of the gospel. When we talk about that gospel, it's interesting. When we talk about that word gospel, and even within the church and within the Christian community, you can line about 100 people up and you're probably going to get 100 different definitions of what the gospel actually is. But when Paul is talking about the gospel has nothing to do with us. And a lot of times you're going to hear definitions of the gospel that include something that we're doing. But Paul's definition and the definition used in the Bible doesn't have anything to do with us. We're not doing anything. And we need to remind ourselves that gospel, by its very definition, and at the core of it, it actually means good news. Good news. The gospel means good news. And the story of the gospel goes all the way back to the beginning of time. You see, the good news is what Jesus does for us. What Jesus has done for us and what Jesus continues to do for us right now. That's the gospel. But it started with Jesus. It started all the way back in Genesis. You see, remember we were talking about Adam and Eve and them wanting their autonomy? You know, before God banished them from the garden and sent them away, He gave them a promise. God promises Adam and Eve, you know what? You blew it. You're no longer allowed to live in the garden, but I am going to fix this. See, Adam and Eve's sin brought sin, death, evil into the world. All this brokenness that we see, it's because of sin. God says, I'm going to fix it. Someday, someone's going to come, and He's going to take care of this problem. And thousands of years later, that someone was born in a little manger in a little village outside of Jerusalem called Bethlehem. And Jesus lived the perfect life. He died the death of a criminal. And then He was raised again to give us life, to give us forgiveness. For me, for you. For our salvation. We deserve what Adam and Eve got. We deserve to be banished from the garden. We deserve hell. But we don't get it. Jesus goes through all of that for us and then gives us life, forgives us of our sin, and brings us into a relationship with Him and the Father. That's the gospel. That's the alternative. Paul's consumed by that story. Here in Romans 1, he mentions this more than once. He begins his chapter by saying, I've been set apart for the gospel. It's all I do. He says he's a slave to telling the gospel. It's all he can do. He says he's eager to preach the gospel. It's all he wants to do. And then he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I am not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Not ashamed. Which is kind of strange. He says, I've been set apart for the gospel. That's all I'm going to do. I'm a slave to the gospel. It's all I can do. I'm eager to preach the gospel. It's all I want to do. And then he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. How does that fit? Well, it fits because if we understand the gospel story right, it's turning everything upside down. You see, both in our society and into the people He chose, for somebody else to come save us from ourselves, to come and save us from what we want to do, well, that's idiocy. That's shame. To think about somebody who would come and live in humility and humiliation and then die, get himself killed, all the while talking about love and forgiveness and peace with God. Are you serious? The Greek gods would never do that. Zeus is all about coming on a white horse in power. He's all about winning it all. He's about using force. He's about putting on the best image. He's all about success. That's Zeus, and that's the stuff we worship. See, the shame of the gospel is somebody coming in weakness, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, no less, to save us. Because we need saving. And Paul's not ashamed of the gospel. And why is he not ashamed? He says it right here. Because it is the power of God for salvation. It's the power. The power needed to make one right with God. The power I need for my sins to be forgiven. The power that I need to save me from myself. It's not coming from the law. It's not coming from God's rules. It only comes from the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus for me on my behalf. That's the power. So you want life change? I want life change. I want things to be different. Then I go embrace the gospel. Oh yes, again, like I said, those rules, those things that we set up in our lives to make our lives orderly, yes, those are all good. Those are healthy. Those are fine. But we can't for a moment fall to the lie that those are the things that are going to make us right with God, or that somehow God is going to be more pleased with me. I can't put my faith and trust in that. My place, my faith has to be in what Jesus has done for me. The law's powerless to help us. The power to save us is in the gospel. The power to do good works. The power for love Los Fresnos on a Little League diamond is not found in rules. If I go out to that diamond because I somehow think that God is going to push some button on me if I don't and smite me, then I have missed the point, because rules can't energize me. Only the gospel. The gospel is the power for all of life, for all of salvation. Losing it all to find everything in Jesus. And Paul ends this section by saying this. It's also another one of those quotes that you find all over the New Testament. He says, the righteous shall live by faith. Now that's a quote from earlier in the Bible. In fact, it also comes from the book of Genesis, where Moses is writing about a guy named Abraham. And Abraham, part of his story is he's always trying to save himself. He's always trying to finagle. And, we look at Jacob, who was his grandson, and we think, man, that guy's a rascal. Well, Grandpa Abraham, he had some issues too with this. Trying to fix things. He had to be brought to the end of himself to realize, you know what? It's only by faith in a promise. The promise of someone who is going to come and save me and fix this. That is the only thing that's going to save me. And Abraham, it says, believed God. Abraham had faith in God, and he was given God's righteousness. Couldn't earn it. Couldn't do it himself. Was only through faith. You see, that's Abraham's story. That's the story of those to whom Paul's writing. That's our story right now. It's a story for Los Fresnos. Sinners who please God because somebody else did it for them. That's our story. It's a story of the gospel. Some of us here this morning are totally stressed out. Some of us are frustrated. What's interesting, if you start to look at what causes stress and what causes frustration, a lot of it goes back to this idea that somehow we are grasping at something, and what we don't realize is we're expecting that something or that someone to save us. It's at the heart and the root of stress and frustration. These are symptoms that believing the law, believing the rules, can save us, can help us. When the only thing that can help us, the only thing that can change our life is the gospel. What Jesus has done for people who cannot do it themselves. How many of you have had to jump a dead car battery? Raise your hand. No. I see. We had that happen this week. What's the likelihood of that car battery starting itself? Zip. Nada. No. Not going to happen. Now, I know there's limits to these analogies that we try to use to understand spiritual things, but it's true. A dead battery is not going to start itself. It's dead. That's the gospel. The gospel is the jump. We have to have that in order to live, in order to do good works, in order to do anything right. Make no mistake, it's always going to be from outside of yourselves. It's always going to be the gospel. It's always going to be what Jesus has done for you and for me. Jesus doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves. That's the story of the gospel. That's the story for us. That's the story for Los Fresnos. So if the gospel is this important, if the gospel is the only thing that can save us, that's the story that we will be telling every week here at the table. We are a people, when we come through those doors, we are a people in need of good news. Because I know from my own experience, even in the past 24 hours, what's on the outside coming in has been nothing but bad news. And I'm not talking about bad news in the sense of, the loss of a loved one, or loss of a job, or a broken relationship, or having a daughter in the hospital. Those things are bad news. But the bad news I'm talking about, the bad news that comes with us into here in need of good news, is more profound. It's a little more personal. It's the fact that we can't save ourselves. We are sinners when we come through that door. We have sinned. That's the bad news. Our bad news is that we have been unkind when we should have been kind. The bad news is that we haven't been very forgiving when we should be forgiving. The bad news is we weren't thinking the best of our spouse or our child. The bad news is we very subtly tried to take advantage of a situation or person. And we carry all that bad news in here. And when we come through that door bringing all the bad news, there is good news waiting for us here. The good news of the gospel that we need to tell ourselves every time we come here and gather here. We have to have the good news because of all the bad news that we have inside. And the power for change, the power for life is only in that good news. What Jesus has done for us. What has He done for us? He came, He lived a perfect life, and then He went and died the death that should have been ours, and then He was raised. That's the good news of the gospel. So, Jesus is here. He's the good news. What He's done for us is the good news. He's doing it for us. He does it for Los Fresnos. And that's the story of the gospel that we will tell ourselves again and again and again. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank You so much for who You are and what You have done for us. We are in need of good news because we know, when we are honest, that our lives are full of bad news. And it's not just things happening to us, but things that we're doing, things that we're believing, things that we are pursuing. And we need to hear Your good news. We need to hear that You have forgiven us when we didn't deserve it. You have given us Your grace. You've given us Your life. As long as the table exists, I pray that the table will be a place where there is always, always, always good news for sinners like me. In Your name I pray. Amen. The story of the gospel is right here. Everything I just talked about, Jesus provides for us right here. You know, this isn't simply a picture. It is a picture. It is a proclamation. But He's actually doing something for us here. He meets us here in this table. This right here is good news because He promised to be in it. He promised to be with us and among us and present for us in the table. Jesus again lived the perfect life, and He died the death of a sinner. And what's interesting about this table is that night when He's meeting with His disciples and He is unpacking for us what is happening here, He says something very interesting at the end of what He is saying about His blood being here in the wine. He says, "This is My blood that is shed for the forgiveness of your sins." Are you kidding me? This is good news. And He says in John 6, "Those who eat of My flesh and drink of My blood have eternal life." So when we come through those doors with our bad news, the good news, both here, the proclamation of what's going on here and what's going on here, is Jesus is saying, I forgive you again. I forgive you and I give you my life. I will be present here among you, I promise. It's the good news of this table. And so I promise you, as long as I'm part of this, and as long as I'm privileged to be part of this, the table will be in the center of the table. Because this is where we find good news. It's where I find my good news. Because I know what I'm like. I need this good news. This is what we cannot do for ourselves. All we bring to this table is our sin. We don't bring our perfections. We don't even bring our perfections to our gathering. You already heard me say it. One of the things about being in a hospital all week this week, as I looked at all, one of the common thing that I have with all the other visitors there is we're visiting somebody who is in need of help. We're not there on fun terms. Nobody's there on fun terms. And I was reminded again as I thought about what we were talking about this morning that the church is a hospital. It is for broken people in need of the healing that Jesus provides in His Word and in His table.